When we analyze ancient textual records, the conventional approach is to focus on their explicit content, the stories they tell. My own investigation, however, begins from a fundamental methodological challenge. What if the most critical information is not located in what is written, but in how it is organized? This forces a shift in perspective. I propose that the architecture of an ancient archive, its deliberate omissions, its fragmented nature, and its structural silences, functions as a distinct layer of data. This archival structure is not a passive container for information, but an active system of organization. When I apply this structural analysis, a recurring pattern emerges. There is often a significant disconnect between the narrative presented and the way that narrative is preserved and transmitted. This suggests a controlled process, where information is not just recorded but actively curated over generations. This observation raises a crucial question for my inquiry. Are we searching for a specific, concealed truth hidden within the text, or should our focus be on the very mechanisms of preservation and omission? The distinction is critical, as it redefines the object of our investigation entirely. The modern pursuit of forbidden knowledge in these ancient sources may therefore be a projection. My work proceeds from the hypothesis that the impression of a hidden doctrine is a byproduct of the archival process itself, a consequence of structural tensions we have yet to fully analyze. My investigation is anchored in a specific set of cuneiform tablets excavated from the Sumerian city of Nippur. These artifacts constitute the primary data set for the structural analysis I am about to conduct. The choice of Nippur is not arbitrary. As a major religious and scribal center for millennia, its archives offer a uniquely controlled environment to study how information was organized, preserved, and transmitted over long periods. Many of these crucial historical records are now housed within institutional collections. I am specifically examining materials held at the British Museum, which allows for a direct material analysis of the tablets themselves. This dispersal of the archive across modern institutions presents an immediate methodological challenge. The collection is no longer a single coherent library, but a reassembled puzzle, which may introduce its own structural biases. My initial examination of these texts focuses on narratives concerning human origins. What becomes immediately apparent is the absence of a single, continuous, linear account comparable to later traditions. Instead of a master narrative, what I find is a mosaic of distinct and often disconnected accounts. This structural fragmentation is the central problem. It forces me to ask whether this is the result of accidental loss or deliberate design. Further analysis shows these accounts exist as fragmented sequences, or textual strata, laid down over one another. Each layer appears to represent a distinct phase of composition or scribal activity, rather than a simple continuation. This layering suggests a dynamic process of copying and reinterpretation. It indicates that these origin narratives were not static records but were actively curated, a process that inherently modifies the information being preserved. The fragmented state of these Nippur records requires a specific methodological response. My primary tool becomes a comparative analysis of parallel accounts, particularly the various creation myths that circulated in different forms. I can, for instance, take the Sumerian flood story fragment found at Nippur and place it alongside later Akkadian versions like the Atrahasis epic. This allows for a direct, text-to-text examination of how the narrative evolves. This comparative approach is not limited to creation narratives. It proves equally effective when I examine the divine genealogies that establish the cosmic hierarchy, particularly the lineage descending from Enlil, the patron god of Nippur itself. These divine family trees are directly linked to the foundational myths of ancient urban centers. The legitimacy of a city like Eridu, for example, is tied directly to its claimed relationship with the god Enki in the textual record. When I compare these parallel versions, a consistent pattern of selective inclusion becomes analytically visible. Certain details or entire episodes are present in one city's tradition, but conspicuously absent from another's. A clear example appears in the varying roles assigned to specific deities. The prominence of the god Enki in the Eridu tradition seems to be intentionally amplified in texts originating from that sphere of influence. What emerges as equally significant is the pattern of deliberate omission. The structural gaps in these genealogies or historical sequences do not appear to be the result of random damage, but of a calculated editorial process. This recurring pattern of selection suggests a process of controlled transmission. It is not a haphazard collection of stories, but a curated library, shaped over generations by what I can only identify as scribal authorities. Such a high degree of consistency points toward the scribal schools, the Edabas, as the central agents of this control. These institutions were the gatekeepers of literate tradition and its sanctioned transmission. This control appears to serve a distinct purpose. The evidence points toward a deliberate reorganization of narrative content, one likely intended to uphold and legitimize specific political and religious orders of the time. When I juxtapose the fragmented origin myths from Nippur with the divine genealogies, a clear organizational logic begins to surface. These two distinct documentary forms are not separate. They appear to be structurally interdependent, with one often providing the framework for the other. A recurring pattern I observe is the use of narrative duplication with specific alterations. A foundational event, such as the establishment of the first city, Eridu, is present across multiple texts, but the divine agent credited with the act can vary, often aligning with a city's patron deity. This suggests that the lineage of a major god, like Enlil in the Nippur tradition, functions as a dominant structural axis. The sequence of myths and historical claims seems to be organized to reinforce the centrality of this specific divine line, creating a coherent, localized theology. When I compare this to traditions associated with other cities, a competing structure becomes visible. Texts that emphasize the importance of the god Enki, for instance, arrange their own cosmological events and genealogies around his lineage, creating a parallel but distinct narrative framework. What I am identifying is a system of thematic modules. A specific narrative block, like the Sumerian flood story, can be inserted, abbreviated, or expanded, depending on the larger genealogical or political argument being constructed by the text in which it is embedded. This modularity explains the structural ruptures I see when comparing different versions of a single myth. The sequence of divine creations in one text may be entirely reordered in another, suggesting that the chronology of events was flexible and served the overall structural purpose. The internal logic, therefore, does not point to a single canonical sequence of history. Instead, it reveals a consistent methodology of narrative assembly. The scribes appear to be working from a shared pool of mythic components, which they arrange to produce specific theological outcomes. This pattern of organization is remarkably consistent across the Nippur archive. The logic is not one of historical reportage, but of theological and political legitimization, built by carefully selecting and sequencing these narrative modules to support a specific worldview. Consequently, the division between different myths, or the breaks within a single account, may not be evidence of lost information. These gaps appear to be a fundamental feature of the system itself, a product of arranging these modules along a chosen divine or royal lineage. The most significant pattern, then, is not found within the stories themselves, but in this consistent architectural method. The scribal authorities were not just copying texts. They were actively curating a flexible and powerful system for constructing reality. This investigation must now track how these specific records traverse significant chronological breaks. I am particularly interested in periods of documented scribal exile or displacement, such as the political upheavals following the fall of the Ur-III dynasty. When I follow the transmission history of a text through such events, I observe a distinct pattern. The relocation of major urban or religious centers appears to correlate directly with observable modifications in the structure of the documents being copied and preserved. This chronological tracking reveals a fundamental misalignment. The original narrative architectures, which I can infer from the earliest Nippur fragments, do not seem to align perfectly with the structures of the subsequent, more widely circulated versions of these same stories. The central tension, therefore, is not a simple matter of lost or damaged tablets. What emerges is a conflict between the document's initial organizational logic and the new framework imposed upon it during a later period of scribal compilation. This forces me to reconsider the nature of the problem. The conflict does not lie between hidden and revealed information, as a search for forbidden knowledge would presuppose. It is a conflict between competing internal textual structures, layered over one another through time. What I am identifying is a friction between the document's original form and the subsequent editorial and theological pressures that reshaped it. The structure itself becomes a record of these historical tensions, an archaeology of its own transmission. This ancient misalignment is now compounded by a modern one. A significant conflict exists between the material reality of these fragmented documents and the interpretative frameworks that are often applied to them in contemporary analysis. These modern readings tend to approach the observed textual discontinuities, the gaps, the contradictions, the abrupt shifts in narrative with a specific set of expectations. There is a tendency to interpret these features as something other than scribal artifacts. This analytical bias often leads to a specific conclusion. The structural ruptures within the record are frequently interpreted as potential evidence of deliberately restricted, esoteric, or censored knowledge, a sign that something was intentionally removed or concealed. The problem with this approach is that it mistakes a symptom for a cause. It treats a structural seam, which is likely a byproduct of archival reorganization or theological debate, as a deliberate signal of some deeper hidden meaning. This modern projection creates an interpretative loop. We search for forbidden truths, and so we interpret the natural, messy process of textual transmission as evidence for their existence, reinforcing our initial assumption without grounding it in the material evidence. My investigation must therefore pivot away from this assumption. The primary object of analysis is not a hypothetical hidden doctrine, but the observable friction between these conflicting textual layers and the modern assumptions we bring to them. This forces my entire line of inquiry to pivot. The central question can no longer be what information was concealed, but must instead become what function did this specific organization of information serve for the scribal authorities who maintained it? To answer this, my investigation must systematically compare the documented cycles of copying, translation, and adaptation that these narratives underwent. I can track how a Sumerian myth is later rendered in Akkadian, and then how that version is itself edited in subsequent centuries. Through this comparative process, what becomes immediately apparent is the remarkable persistence of specific thematic elements. Despite significant variations in narrative detail, a core set of ideas survives across different languages, cities, and historical epochs. These recurring components almost invariably include a non-terrestrial or external origin for humanity and a direct, formative intervention in human affairs by entities described as superior. These are not peripheral details, they appear to be foundational axioms of the system. The consistent repetition of these core elements suggests they served a primary function of legitimization. By anchoring a ruling dynasty or a priestly class to a cosmic, non-human source of authority, their worldly power was presented as an extension of the cosmic order itself. This mechanism seems particularly potent when linked to a specific city's patron deity, as I observed with Enlil at Nippur. The narrative architecture works to reinforce the idea that the local political structure is not a human invention, but a divinely ordained reality. Beyond political legitimization, this repetition also appears to function as a powerful mechanism for establishing and maintaining long-term cultural continuity. It creates a stable, shared history that can withstand periods of immense social and political disruption. This brings me to a critical methodological insight. The impression of a forbidden truth may not be an external reality, but an internal byproduct of these very archival dynamics. The process of curating a tradition inherently creates gaps, seams, and silences. When a narrative is constantly reorganized to serve the function of legitimization, its structure is necessarily altered. These structural ruptures, which we might misinterpret as censorship, could simply be the scars left by generations of theological and political recalibration. Therefore, the field of this inquiry must shift away from a search for lost content. It must now focus on the structural function of these records, and crucially, on the analytical distance that has opened between their original form and their modern reception. This brings my investigation back to the physical cuneiform tablets from Nippur, but my perspective on them has fundamentally shifted. They are not merely records of the past, but artifacts of a highly sophisticated system of information management. My analysis suggests this archival structure was not a passive repository for myths and genealogies. It appears to function more like an engine, designed to consistently generate a specific, sanctioned model of cosmic and political order for its society. What I may be looking at, then, is not simply literature, but a form of information technology. Its primary purpose seems to be the construction and maintenance of a durable social reality through the careful management of historical memory. The recurring themes I identified, an external origin for humanity, intervention from superior entities, are therefore not just narrative choices. They appear to be the core functional components of this technology, the essential axioms upon which the entire system is built. This forces a profound shift in the central question of my inquiry. It is no longer sufficient to ask how this system of knowledge was organized. I must now ask why these specific foundational ideas were chosen and why they proved so resilient across millennia. What specific problem of social or political organization did the narrative of an externally created humanity solve so effectively? This suggests the myths themselves are not the final answer, but a highly optimized solution to a much deeper, unstated challenge. The object of my investigation must therefore expand. It must move beyond the documentary architecture of the archive to the cognitive and social pressures that demanded its very existence in this particular form and with this specific content. The Nippur archive, then, may not be the mystery itself, but a meticulously engineered answer. My next task is to fully define the fundamental human question to which this vast and complex textual machine was the intended solution.